All right, hello everybody. So today is our lecture on Choson Korea and the development of Yangban society. Today we begin with our examination of the society, so social history. Up until now we have looked at political history, the political history of Choson, and now that we have that as a foundation, as a building block, you understand now how the government was structured and how it functioned, and how Joseon dealt with foreign countries, and how then this changed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And now we will use that as our basic building block, and then add to this now a look at the society. And we have to understand how the government was structured, and how the politics, how they were run, in order to understand why society was structured in the way that it was. All right, so when we look at the structure of Joseon society, there are basically four classes of people. At the top we have the Yangban aristocratic elite, and then just below them is a secondary status group, the Jungin, or the middle people, and then below them are the commoners, and then the low people. So the commoners were really the bulk of the population, and they were the ones who were mostly responsible for paying taxes, and they were the ones who were suspect to serving in the military and being conscripted as soldiers. Also, they had to participate in corvée labor. And what corvée labor is, it's when the government needs some kind of public project to be carried out. So let's say there's a road that needs to be repaired. Well, then the commoners are conscripted, and they need to then, the able-bodied men will then be asked to, in that area, repair the road. And they're not paid for this, and they had to provide for their own food while they were on this public project. So it was a burden for the commoners, because this was taking time away from their general normal livelihood to do something else. For example, another example is, let's say, the main palace, or the capital city. The king wants to build a wall around the palace. Well, then you have to conscript laborers, and you have to call upon corvée labor again to do this. So in these instances, it was the commoners, and the Yangban were exempt from this. So although there were changes in the society, we're going to look at the Yangban for today, to see what the Yangban role was and how they ended up maintaining their position in society. So first of all, who were the Yangban? This term Yangban, it literally means the two classes of officials, the military and the civil officials. So this is what this original term refers to, is the civil and the military officials. They are the bureaucrats. They are merit subjects, which means that they are the supporters of the royal family when Lee Sang-ge first established the Joseon dynasty. They are Confucian literati. The nucleus of the Yangban, they are these hereditary aristocratic families. So although they sat for the civil service examination, and there's somewhat of a meritocratic aspect to the examinations. There's also a hereditary aspect, which we will go into momentarily. They're the ones, the Yangban, they directed the government, and they eventually become a discrete social category. The responsibilities of the Yangban were to study Confucian doctrine. So, as mentioned in previous lectures, the architects of the Choson dynasty, they chose Confucian ideology on which to structure their government. So, government officials were required to study Confucian doctrine. They were expected to self-cultivate. So as, and we will go into in a few lectures in much more detail about Confucian ideology itself. But let's just suffice it to say at this point that in Confucian ideology, because a very important aspect of being a leader and being a government official is perfecting your morality and being a very moral and ethical person. This requires self-cultivation, and in order to do this, you have to study. But this is what qualifies you to govern other people and to be a moral model. So for the Yangban, their sole responsibility was to hold public office. They were not allowed to hold technical posts, such as in medicine or law or translation. Again, we will go into the this middle people class, the Zhongyan, in a later lecture. But that was the responsibility. These technical duties were the responsibilities of the middle people. The Yangban did not engage in this. They also did not participate in farming or commerce or manufacturing. So they were only supposed to dedicate their lives to holding public office as either civil or military officials. Now, yet the Yangban, because they were the aristocratic elite, they had a very high status. And they went to very great lengths to protect this status. So, for example, they only married amongst each other. They did not marry outside of their class. There were times when Yangban men, obviously there are exceptions to this rule. There are times when Yangban men would take secondary wives from a lower status, but oftentimes those children, the offspring of that union, would then take the lower status of their mothers. And so because of this downward social mobility, it was really in the best interest, if you wanted to maintain your status, to marry someone of equal or greater status to you. The Yangban, they also they lived in separate areas in Seoul, and they lived in villages, and then also in specific areas of the village. And there were distinctions also within the Yangban class. For example, the civil officials were considered to be much more prestigious than the military officials. And eventually, by the time we get to the latter half of the Choson dynasty, the sons of secondary wives were not able to sit for the civil service examination. And so if you don't sit for the civil service examination, then that means you are not qualified to hold government office. There was also regional discrimination, so particularly against the northern provinces in Korea, there was discrimination against them. So what we see happening through the course of the dynasty, and as the numbers of the Yangban increase, there are increasing attempts to try to restrict access to Yangban status, or to decrease the numbers, since the Yangban population is just growing too much. Some of the privileges that the Yangban experienced were they were exempt from military service. So let's say during the Imjin Wars or the Hideyoshi invasions, when Japan was attacking Korea, well, the Choson dynasty needs to conscript soldiers in order to defend themselves. This came largely from the commoner class. The Yangban were not obligated to serve in the military. Another privilege that they had was they received stipends for their as like their official salaries, and prebends. And these prebends are land. So they are a part of the salary that you receive if you are a government official. And then there's something called the protection privilege. So let's say that you are a young Yangban man, and you have not passed the civil service examination yet. You're still in the midst of studying. You can take a position in the government through the protection privilege. There were a certain number of government appointments or government positions that you could get through this privilege. So you then would be a government official, and then you take the examination later. And so this gets your foot in the door in the bureaucracy, at least. Sons of Yangban men were guaranteed access to the capital schools that fed into the Sungkyunkwan. The Sungkyunkwan was the Royal Confucian College. And there were also merit awards. So we will discuss this in just a moment. If you look at this depiction of the life of a Yangban, this is from a screen. They have these large folding screens, and each panel depicts a stage in the life of a Yangban. The first is the 1-year birthday, the Tol. This is a big, still even today, a big milestone for the first birthday is considered to be a momentous birthday. There's the wedding ceremony, so when a Yangban gets married. There's passing the civil service examination. That's also a big milestone in the life of a Yangban. And one's first official appointment. In this particular case of this person, after his appointment, he was later on appointed as the magistrate of Songdo, and then after this became the Minister of Defense, and his last appointment was as Minister of the Left, and this is the second highest position in the government. So obviously this particular Yangban did very well for himself and was considered to be successful. And then finally, the last milestone is the wedding anniversary. And what you see depicted here are an elderly couple who have lived many decades together and are celebrating their wedding anniversary. So this really depicts the major milestones in the life of a Yangban. This particular screen is housed in the Korea University Museum, so if you are interested in seeing it in real life, you can go check it out there. All right, so as I said, the Yangban went to really extensive measures in order to protect and maintain their Yangban status. Not only because of the social status, but there were many economic and political, ideological privileges that were associated with being a Yangban. What you see depicted here in these slides are Yangban. They are officials, they are scholars, and in the picture on the right here you see that they are being entertained. There were sumptuary regulations during the CHOSON dynasty, and what this means is that there were restrictions depending on your class on how large your house could be, what kind of clothing you could wear, what kind of eating utensils you could use, the kind of transportation that you would use. I mean, these are all what you call sumptuary regulations. So, immediately just by looking at somebody, you knew what their status was, because the Yangban were able to use nicer things, nicer eating utensils, nicer forms of transportation, nicer clothes, and so immediately you could tell. And this is a depiction of more Yangban, and you see all kinds of household staff and servants who are working. So because of this, the Yangban, they really wanted to protect themselves, and one way that they could do this was through the examinations. So in theory, the examinations were open to anybody, but realistically, it was only the Yangban who could prepare for the examinations. It just took vast amounts of resources to prepare for this. You had to start studying at a very young age, and to read the Confucian classics in classical Chinese, it takes years and years of study, and oftentimes you would have to hire famous Confucian scholars as your private tutors, and that also requires resources. And so, although in theory it was open to anybody, it was not, realistically. And the Yangban, over time, were able to monopolize the exams, monopolize education, and monopolize the exams. Later on, to even sit for the exam, to take the examination, you had to produce 4 names of relatives who had previously passed the examination, and this would qualify you to sit for the exam. And if you have generations of men in your family who are failing the examination, then this has a direct effect on the later generations and their ability to sit for the examinations. Because if you can't produce the names of your relatives who have passed, then you're automatically excluded. There were different kinds of examinations. There was a whole process, and you had to pass first, these local exams, and then it went all the way up to the exam where you go to the palace itself, and the king is supposedly administering the exam, and so you have to pass this series of exams, and there's a whole hierarchy of these, and they are all based on Confucian texts. Some of the inherent problems of this, well, education became extremely elitist. It's not actually that different from today, where you have those families with the most amount of resources who are able to have access to the best education. This is exactly what we see in the Joseon Dynasty. And so those who have the most resources have the most access. There were problems with cheating on the exams. Again, this is nothing new. History often repeats itself, and this is a great example of that. So we have problems with cheating on the exams, and the content of the exams also were somewhat problematic because sometimes they emphasize things that were not necessarily practical and for governance, but were more literary. But this idea of what qualifies as knowledge, this is controlled by the king and his officials. So it's not a total complete meritocracy, but it is a way to try to recruit government officials who exhibit some amount of talent. All right, now if we look at the salary and the land that the Yangban received in return for their service to the state, there is something called rank land. And this is land that is given to incumbent and former officials. And they are given this land, they are allowed to collect rent from this land. So let's say if they have a large amount of land and they then rent it out to farmers, and then they collect the rent from the land. The state grants them the right to collect this rent. It does not mean that they own the land, it just means that they have the right to collect the rent. This, though, is treated as private property over time, though. So by the time we get to the latter half of the Joseon Dynasty, this rank land is being treated as private land. And this right to collect the rent becomes passed down and is inherited by their heirs. And there was also crop sharing. So sometimes the landowner and the cultivator would harvest these crops, and they would be shared. The owner was supposed to pay 10% rent to the state from his share, but again, by the time we get to the latter half of the dynasty, that 10% gets passed along to the farmers. And so what happens over time is an expansion of these land holdings and income from these lands, because the Yangban were able to expand their estates. And when that happens, when you have these very large land holdings, these very large estates that are controlled by a Yangban family, then all of that income that is coming from that land goes directly to the Yangban and not to the government. And so this becomes a fiscal issue for the government as we near the end of the dynasty. And when the government has very little revenue coming in and they need to increase their taxes, that tax burden is shifted again to the peasants. And so by the end of the dynasty, there's a greater tax burden for the peasants as well. There was also something called merit land. Now, when Yi Seong-ge, he established the Joseon Dynasty in 1392, he needed people to support him. He needed people who would be his allies and be faithful and loyal to him as he established this new dynasty. And so those who were the supporters of him and his royal household, they were considered to be kind of a special class of people. And these people who played a prominent role in establishing the dynasty, they received merit land in addition to rank land. And this merit land, whereas rank land, if you were a Yangban official and you served out your service as a government official and then retired, in theory, that land was supposed to be given back to the state. So once you retire, that land is supposed to go back to the state. Merit land is different. Merit land could be held forever, in perpetuity. So you could have this land, you could then pass it down to your heirs, and that would stay in the family forever. And these people who received this merit land, these people began to occupy the highest offices in the government. They, over time, held the most amount of land and the most number of slaves. They intermarried with the royal household, and many of them were based in the capital in Seoul. So as a result, what we see is what I call the emergence of these super Yangban, these central Yangban. These were the most powerful Yangban families, and because of all these reasons, they had the largest amount of land, the largest number of slaves. They intermarried with the royal household, and so they had the most amount of power and status. And then there were also different Yangban. Some of them were in the countryside. Some of them were excluded from political power. As we mentioned in previous lectures, there were factional disputes, and so let's say you had allied yourself with a faction that ended up being on the losing side of the game. Well, then those individuals were excluded from political power. So sometimes those Yangban would retreat to the countryside. So they had social prestige, but they were no longer politically powerful. But the point of this is to remember that the Yangban, they drew their power from office holding, from merit, from the civil service examinations, and from the fact that their social class was it was ascriptive, and they had these sumptuary regulations. All right, all of this is based on Confucian ideology, and what we see is the rise of Neo-Confucianism in about the 15th century, especially in the countryside first, because in the capital, the government officials, they kind of adhered to a more pragmatic form of Confucianism. But Neo-Confucianism is much more metaphysical. Metaphysics is the investigation of the principle of reality. It's very philosophical. And so we have these different forms of Neo-Confucian schools that are developing during the Choson dynasty. And by the 18th century, we have many, many different Neo-Confucian scholars. And Neo-Confucianism becomes much more metaphysical, and it focuses on the purification of Li, or principle, and proper relationships. So in the Neo-Confucian in the Neo-Confucian world, there are two main things. There's principle and there's matter, and the two are interdependent and they are inseparable. So to give you an example, let's say that this cup is a cup because of principle, because of, this is the formation and the idea of what makes this a cup, but it's the physical matter which gives it its actual cup-like qualities. So these two principle and matter are interdependent, but depending on whether or not you emphasize principle or you emphasize matter, there are these different schools of thought that begin to develop. So the Korean emphasis on principle is an emphasis on moral self-cultivation. So the idea that there's this principle in everybody, and it is like your human nature, and it in itself is pure and perfect, but it doesn't become pure unless you actively purify it. So in its original state, it's pure, but you have to continually try to purify it. And this requires study, this requires self-cultivation, this requires meditative thinking. And so there were different schools of thought that grew out of this idea, or this particular emphasis on principle in Neo-Confucianism. There were also other schools of thought that emphasized matter, or qi. And there are quite a few very influential Neo-Confucian Korean scholars, such as Yi or Yulgok, and he and his disciples, they emphasized matter through more pragmatic things, like reform proposals on the government and reform of the economy and defense of the country. And so because there were these different emphases, we have the development of many different schools of Neo-Confucian thought. And this is part of where the factionalism came from. And then it was also related to the politics, because if you had been trained in from a certain school of thought, and then it's these students of this school who continue to pass the civil service examination and dominate the high positions in the government, and they kind of favor each other, then this is what connects Neo-Confucian thought, factionalism, and politics. All right, so we do see the emergence of the Neo-Confucian literati. So these are, due to a succession of purges and the intensification of factional strife, many Neo-Confucian literati, they decided to abandon their careers in government and to devote themselves to scholarship. So and educating the younger generation. So they were, many of these were more interested in theoretical studies rather than practical scholarship. And so then they retreat to the countryside and they establish bases for themselves out there to develop their scholarship and to train younger generations of scholars. And from these bases, we see the development of what are called private academies, or CHOSON. And these private academies, they also became shrines to dedicated scholars or eminent worthies, moral people from an earlier period. And beginning around the 16th century, the kings began to bestow royal charters on these private academies. So they would officially recognize these academies. And by 1608, there were more than 100 CHOSON, and royally chartered private academies increased. And what the state would do then was they would grant them books, they would give them tax-free land, or if they had land, they wouldn't tax it. They gave them slaves. And so over time, they became institutions that were supported by the state. But the private academies, they had no obligation to the state, and they did not productively contribute anything to the state. So it was really just more of a take scenario rather than a give and take scenario. And so you see the real rapid increase of these private academies. And this also will have an effect on the economy by the end of the Joseon dynasty, which we will get to in a later lecture. All right, so what were some of the ways that these Confucian or Neo-Confucian scholars and officials, what made them Confucian was the rituals. According to Jushi and the family rites of Jushi, the family rituals are some of the most important rituals to be performed. There were funerary and memorial rituals, so these were rituals to be performed when a member of the family dies, and the memorial rituals are for to commemorate the deaths of your relatives or your ancestors, so your mother or your father. These rituals became so important because in Confucian ideology, the family is the basic unit of society, and so it is imperative, absolutely critical, to maintain the family. So what happens is, as the Yangban population expands, there become questions over who is allowed to perform these rituals. So, for example, if there's only one son from the primary wife, and he dies at a young age, then are the sons from the secondary wives, are they now eligible to perform these rituals? If they are, then which one? Which one is allowed to perform the ritual? So because of this, we begin to see a distinction between primary and secondary wives. So in the Yangban family, particularly the most powerful Yangban, many Yangban men would have their primary wife who was either of equal Yangban status or from the royal household. But they also had many secondary wives or concubines, and these women came from a variety of different social statuses. And in order to make it clear, by the time we get to the mid-dynasty, the latter half of the Joseon dynasty, there's a distinction between the primary and the secondary wives, and also the sons of the primary and the secondary wives. And all of the wealth then becomes concentrated in the first son of the primary wife, and the sons of the secondary wives now are shut out. And they are not eligible for Yangban status. And the way that they did this was they restricted them from sitting for the civil service examinations. And if you can't sit for the civil service examination, then you're not qualified to receive a position in the government. If you don't receive a position in the government, you don't get rank land, you don't get your salary and your title, and you're just not able to maintain your status as a Yangban. So we see this restriction to Yangban status that begins to emerge in the latter half of the Joseon dynasty. So this is what is happening in society now. Why did they do this? It's not just because they wanted to restrict the status, but it's also a way to eliminate your competition. So, as the Yangban numbers are multiplying, and you have a larger population of men who are sitting for the civil service examination, but they are competing for a fixed number of government positions. The competition then becomes too fierce. And so to eliminate your competition, you make that distinction between primary and secondary wives. And now all the sons of secondary wives are no longer eligible to sit for the civil service examination. This is also a matter of resources. So, for example, let's say let me find a piece of paper here. Let's say this piece of paper represents the family's assets. And let's say instead of concentrating all of these assets in the first son and only one son, you decide to divide up your assets. So for the sake of ease, let's say there are two sons. Usually there are more, but let's say there are two sons. You split this in half. Okay. Now each son gets this much of the assets. And then this son has two sons. And then you split this in half. And now each son has this much of the family's assets. And then this son, now we're in the third generation, has two sons. And they split this, divided in half. And now you have, each son gets this amount of the assets. What is happening to the family fortune? It is shrinking. Right? So instead of doing it this way, during the Joseon dynasty, the Yangban said, we are going to take the family's assets and we're going to pass it down to the oldest son of the primary wife, who will then pass it down to the oldest son of the primary wife, who will then pass it down to the oldest son of the primary wife. And you see then that family's assets remain intact instead of being divided up and shrinking. So this is also a matter of assets and preserving the family assets for the family. Okay, so this is what we saw occurring during the Choson dynasty, and some of the changes that occurred during the latter half, and how this Yangban society developed. The one question or one thing that we need to look at is the historical context of this. So in the late 16th century, we have 2 Japanese invasions by Hideyoshi, and then in the early 17th century, there are Manchu invasions, and so from the perspective of the Choson dynasty, both the state perspective and from the Yangban perspective, the goal is really to maintain stability. It is about avoiding radical change, preserving tradition, and maintaining stability. And this is precisely what Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism allowed and enabled the Yangban to do. So they were able to maintain and perpetuate their status throughout the dynasty. And then this also then contributed to political stability in the sense that we don't have major change occurring in the government. The Yangban, because as especially those Yangban who become the most powerful, the super Yangban, they have the most to lose and the least to gain if there is some kind of major change. And so from their perspective, it is about maintaining the status quo and trying to preserve their status and their assets. So this is what we see happening with the development of Yangban society. Now, in other aspects of society, when we look at the middle people and the commoners, it's a very different story, and we will look at that in a different lecture. So in the following lecture, we will continue our look at the society of the Choson dynasty.